All right, we have Paul Hansen on the line. It's May the 6th, and the question came in earlier today regarding biblical marriage, whether the state needs to acknowledge it or whether an ordained minister has to be involved. And Kent suggested you may have some thoughts on this topic, Mr. Hansen, and we're certainly would like to hear what you got to say. So it's all you, sir. We're looking forward to it.
Sure. The question been posed to me is how do people get married independent of the state? Oftentimes you'll hear states talk about we don't recognize common law marriages. Family members will say, if you're not married by an ordained minister or licensed minister, you're living in adultery or fornication or something like that. Living in sin, basically. The marriage license started real close to the end of the war between the states, and when Lincoln's War got over, some people were still marrying people the whites were marrying the blacks, and they couldn't find anybody to marry them. So that couple would go to the state and say, "What are we going to do here?" They said, "Well, we'll step in. We'll marry you. Your church doesn't want to marry you. We'll marry you." But anyway, that's pretty much how it started. Before that, they didn't have the state involvement in marriage license or marriage agreements. A marriage in biblical eyes is an agreement, the covenant. Covenants are different than contracts. I don't really want to go into all the details of the difference, but there is a difference. If you just go up to a woman and shake her hand, ask for a contract, she's probably not going to be too thrilled about courtship. The covenant is a lot deeper relationship. The question posed was, if a couple wants to get married, do they have to have a ordained minister or a licensed minister do the ceremony? The answer to that is absolutely no. In order for the state to recognize it, there's two different ways to have a state recognize it. The state can recognize it as in their jurisdiction, and the state can recognize it outside of their jurisdiction. We'll talk about that a little bit. But basically, the agreement to get married, the covenant is just between the man and the woman, biblically. Now, when you bring the state into it, that's another party to the agreement, to the covenant. When you bring the state into it, it's not so much covenant anymore. It's a contract. It's a statutory contract. They write the rules for that marriage, and when you go to that state officer and ask him to marry you, you're taking on the written laws of that state to govern that marriage, and that's not good. Oftentimes, it can lead to a whole lot of problems. States like marriage licenses because it gives them more control. It gives them a tremendous amount of control over time, generally, historically speaking. In some jurisdictions across the world, you had to get permission from the king before you could get married. Now, if you weren't of the same faith as that king, you weren't going to get married. And if you try to get married without the king's blessing, you're facing exile or death or imprisonment or something like that. Okay, anyway, state license is permission, it's a contract. I recommend staying away from that, especially if you're a Christian, because the only agreement the only party you want to have with your marriage is you and your spouse. Of course, you wanted to have the family come in to witness it, and of course, God wanted him to be the head of the marriage. So, in relationship to state licenses, if you live on state property and they require a state license.
This call is from the San Jose County Sheriff's Office.
If you live on state property and they require that they make it clear that they do not recognize common law marriages, you'll probably run into some difficulties, but most people do not live on state property. Therefore, it's a lot simpler when you don't live on state property. But if you don't live on state property, you have complete liberty to be married under biblical standards with no relationship in any way with the state. When they talk about, the state talks about not recognizing common law marriages, they're only talking about activity, relationships, production of children and so forth on their land. They're not talking about activities that are not within their territorial jurisdiction. So it's a little bit of a trickery play on words. When anybody says common law, you've got to remember, you've got to study ask them what they're saying. Because the United States Code and some state statutes, they reference common law. But they're only, if you go into the definition section and find out what they're talking about in common law, all they're referring to is what's coming to that jurisdiction. They're not talking about your common law, they're talking about their common law. So the United States Code, for example, it does use common law, but it's defined as their law, their written law. I said earlier that when you take a relationship with the state, that three people involved, the state, the father and the mother in the marriage, and the state is considered, when you're associated with the state jurisdiction, is considered the head of that contract. That the father and mother are below that, which is not good. I don't really care to have the state governing my affairs. What I would do is I would choose a local church to govern any of the disputes or anything that would occur in your marriage. Just write up an agreement between you and your to-be spouse, and write how try to search the scriptures to find out how you're going to handle disputes, and apply them exactly how the scriptures tell you to, and go to the church and ask them to aid you in adjudicating that dispute in a sense. And I would highly recommend going to a non-501c3 church, a non-state church, to determine what is right between that relationship that is separate from the state. There's a story. Let me say, if you take a state license, the state can determine how many vaccines your children are required to take. They can determine the education that child's gonna have. Some states do not allow homeschooling. Other states do allow it. I would not go looking for a state that allows homeschooling. I would just simply not get a state license. That way you can go to any state and homeschool. They're going to try to trick you into being submitted to the state's jurisdiction. Some states, when you're homeschooling, and you just contact me, and we can write a brief up and a legal notice to them that they lack jurisdiction because you're not conducting your marriage on state land. Another thing that they can govern is discipline of your children. If you, when you have a child with a state license, the child belongs to the state foremost, and the father and mother are only considered caretakers of the state property. So the state's going to tell you how to discipline that child. They find red marks on the backside of that child, you can be prosecuted for damaging state property. That does happen. Children are spanked in a public setting, and they're turned into the authorities, and they go to jail. They're prosecuted. Not good. I'm not advocating child abuse in any way, but states are getting so far away from the biblical premise that raising your child will be almost a complete failure if you go by the state standards. Here's a true story of an individual. I wasn't told exactly who it was, but I think it was in Nebraska. I don't know exactly. Either it was a state close by. But an individual had a marriage with a state license, and they had a child. And they started learning about, after they got married, of separation from state jurisdiction and so forth. And anyway, they went in and had the child, and they didn't want to sign all the papers that the hospital wanted to required them to sign before they could take the child home. And they wanted them to fill out the papers to get a Social Security number, finish the birth certificate, things like that. And they didn't want to sign the papers. And it turned into a kind of a heated argument. And the father and mother, just the next morning, they just bundled up their child and went home. And the sheriff shows up at their door, and the guy comes to the door and he says, "May I help you?" And the sheriff says, "Yeah, we're here to get state property."
This call is from the Santa Rosa County Sheriff's Office.
He says, "We got a document here. We got a warrant to pick up the state property." And then the sheriff explained that that child was state property because of the marriage license. So the sheriff flat out said, "That child is state property. It's not your property." And they had to turn the child over and basically do what the state required. One way to get away from maybe getting a Social Security number and at least a Social Security number and birth certificate, is to say that your religion, if you do have a state license, say that your religion encourages naming your child after it develops a personality. Therefore, you don't have to give it a name right away, and you got some time to think about, what are you going to do. But if the child's born under a state license, the only way you can get that thing nullified is go into a court and explain that there wasn't full disclosure and that you never intended to have state as a party to the marriage contract. And you'll probably prevail on that if you push it properly. So, any questions then, Rudy?
No, I find that very interesting. We often get questions about, the definition of biblical marriage and whether to what extent the government should be involved and is an ordained minister required. So it's very good for you to cover this topic and share your thoughts, because I think it helps answer a lot of questions that often come in on the same question. So I appreciate you sharing that. One thing I need to say before we run out of time is if you could please let Pastor Hovind know that his attorney will be visiting him today. So that's Thomas Keith, and I just wanted to make sure I get that message in. But any other, I can't think of any questions. I mean, let me ask you this question. If a couple gets married in the normal way, right, with a preacher and goes and gets a marriage license from the state, do you consider that like a sin? Have they actually done something wrong unknowingly? And is there any way to rectify that once it's already been happened?
Well, if you can get to it if you cancel the marriage contract with the state before the child is born, it's quite easy because there's no property to divide. So, yeah, I believe the state.
You have 60 seconds remaining.
All 50 states are associated with the federal government. The federal government has condoned killing 70 million babies. I don't think that jurisdiction has any business. You don't have any business associating yourself with such a group of people.
Amen to that.
They're far from God. Yeah, they're far from God's standards. So, Go ahead.
No, thank you, Mr. Hovind. I will get this out on YouTube, and it'll be a good to share your thoughts on this topic since we get so many questions. So thank you very much for calling in and sharing that. And if there's any other topics you want to get out, let us know, and we will certainly do it. We're praying for you, sir. We know we got 11 days to go, and it's getting down to the wire.
Okay. I'm Paul Hansen here. You misquoted Hovind.
Oh, I'm sorry. I know my brain is fried. I got so many things going on at once. I meant Mr. Hansen. Okay, we just lost him. And I apologize for that. I should have called him Mr. Hansen. I tell you, there's just so many things going on, and these phone calls, it's a challenge sometimes. We do the best that we can with the resources that we got. Thank God that he called in, and we'll get this out to YouTube. Praise God.